This video is going to be epic, chock full of conversions, sculpting, custom stencils, hacking up jigsaw blades, decals, oil washes, and yes, even painting. Grab some popcorn, a Dr. Pepper, sit back, and enjoy the show.
Commissions, the lifeblood of miniature painters' hobby fund around the world. It always begins with the best of intentions, but greed and naivety poison the well soon after. How quickly the backlog grows with the dreams of others while reality sets in. Time fades into oblivion, leaving nothing but regret and ill will. But not all is lost. Hobbyists can find their strength, reclaim the trust they once lost, like the fire of passion and motivation once more, and one by one, the commissions are finished. Freedom from the prison of guilt is in sight, but there is one more beast to slay. Something still lurks in the closet of hobby shame. Something massive. Something evil. A hulking metal construct with the corrupted spirit, a representation that humanity's finest achievements can be tainted by chaos, a renegade knight.
Well, as the scary narrator lady said, today we're going to be working on a Renegade Knight. I'll be taking the standard kit and converting it. You might ask why I'm doing this, given that a stock Renegade kit is available for purchase, and the answer is that I took this commission when that kit didn't exist. I'll let you do the math on that one. This is my last commission I have remaining, so let's crush it. So if you weren't aware, a knight is a very large model with many pieces. Because of this, even a simple step like cleaning and assembling the model can take a decently long time. Just like on smaller miniatures, we're clipping away various parts off of the sprue, shaving away extra sprue bits, removing mold lines, filling gaps, drilling holes in otherwise solid gun barrels, and gluing together some parts with plastic glue. I've done each of these hobby steps in many other videos, so if you'd like more context, I'll link some videos in the description that go over these steps in more detail. I'll be keeping the majority of this model in pieces, which will make painting it significantly easier. To handle each of the individual pieces, I took a page out of the Scale Modeling Handbook and cut lengths of bamboo skewers, adhered each part to my makeshift handle with poster tack, and then stabbed it into some Kaizen foam. Some comments about this. I'd probably prefer to use double-sided tape instead of poster tack because I always hate dealing with it. It sometimes fails, can be hard to remove from the part, it reacts with certain liquids, etc. Also, I only use Kaizen foam because that's what I had laying around. Normally, you'd see scale modelers using a cat scratch board. Now, the person who commissioned this model wanted me to magnetize the weapons so he could swap them out whenever he fancied, so I had to do some magnetization. I tried a bunch of different ideas to get this to work. I tried hiding the magnets inside the weapon so you could slot them in and out. I tried backfilling the weapons with little cute styrene discs so I could glue magnets in and then surround them with epoxy sculpt, but In the end, they were just too weak, causing the weapons to droop and also making me scared that at any point they could fall and shatter into a million pieces. That probably wouldn't happen, but you never know. What worked in the end was drilling a 10mm hole in the arms and gluing in a neodymium magnet flush with the surface that was also 10mm. Then I cut off some of the arm bits and replaced them with a piece of brass and a magnet glued together with super glue. Once painted, this just looks like another robotic arm part, and it's sufficiently strong to hold the weight of the weapons. Of the various approaches that I tried, this was the simplest and also the best. Side note, if you want to replicate my process entirely, make sure your power goes out in the middle of the day, forcing you to be out in the sun hobbying. Ah, I'm melting! Alright, that's all for assembly. Now, on to the conversions. We'll start with the simpler conversions and get more complicated as we go along. The guy who commissioned this wanted the model to have some bullet holes scattered across the armor, so I took my Dremel and drilled some holes into the armor, making sure to vary the size of the drill bit to simulate damage from different projectiles. I then took my X-Acto knife and beveled the edges of some holes a little bit, like a chunk of the armor was removed when the impact occurred. With the same rotary tool, I used a bull burr tip to create some rough surface texture where maybe some weapons didn't punch all the way through the armor. Sometimes when doing this, little plastic shavings kind of gunk up all the conversions, and I deal with that by just applying some Tamiya extra thin plastic cement to the shavings. It melts them right off, leaving a nice, clean effect. This is a helpful tip that I picked up from Plasmo, a great scale model YouTuber. I try to be reserved about how much of this weathering I did. This machine is old and war-torn, but I didn't want it to dominate the entire model. Just like salt in food, you gotta season to taste. At several points, I was inspired by the actual Renegade Knight kit, so I made several conversions to match, like the spiky triangles on the armor trim. With an X-Acto knife, I scuffed up the surface where I had planned to add the little trim detail. This gave the surface some tooth for the epoxy sculpt to adhere to, which I sculpted with various metal tools and silicone shapers until I got a vaguely triangle-like shape. I made sure this was vaguely flush with the surface, but also after it cured, I sanded it down so it was nice and seamless. Still being inspired by the stock Renegade kit, I also added a lot of pokey bits to the main hull, like this staff from my Blackstone Fortress game, or various spears or track pins. I wanted a variety of width and length. Alright, now on to the main weapons. For the big beady fist, I wrapped two types of chains around the knuckles and secured them in place with super glue thin, a technique that I'll show later with footage that doesn't look like total trash. I also glued some little skulls onto the ends of the chains, but again, this footage is pretty garbage. For the big buzzsaw blade, I was inspired by another Renegade Knight by Monstroids, who used an actual jigsaw blade. I grabbed one of my used jigsaw blades and cut it down to size using a metal cutting disc and my rotary tool. At first, I didn't really know how to approach it apparently. Off camera, I also filed down the teeth of the blade to make it dull, but not too dull, because I like my commissions to have some kind of liability. Don't tell my wife that I said that. I then used styrene to create a housing for it, complete with trim around the edges. I was trying to make it fit in with the other saw in terms of design so it looked normal and like it belonged. Once all the trim had been glued to the saw housing, I scraped and sanded the trim so it meshed with the rest of my conversion, and that was the saw weapon sorted. Sorted? British vocabulary is rubbing off on me after watching 4 seasons of Love Island. I swear, it's my wife's idea. Taking a break from weapons for a hot minute, let's make a robot loincloth. All the knights have banners that hang very awkwardly in between their legs. All I'm reminded of when seeing these banners are the AT-ATs on Hoth getting tripped up. I instead added the banner, flag, loincloth, kilt, whatever it is, higher up on the model around the waist, you know, like a normal person might do. I started by making the holes around the waist larger so I could attach some chain to them. Normally I just super glue stuff like this in, but this time I actually pinched a chain link closed around the hole so it made for a nicer, realistic connection. Before closing off the other side, we need to thread the banner on this chain, and to create that banner, I used brass shim stock. I sketched out the basic shape of my banner with a Sharpie and cut it out using an X-Acto knife. I was struggling with cutting out the corners of this banner, and a good solution to deal with them was to drill out each corner with the Dremel first, and then connect the dots essentially with my X-Acto knife. The edges were pretty jagged, so I cleaned it up with a file. Brass shim stock is super thin, so I can bend and curve the surface to my heart's content. It doesn't exactly look perfectly like cloth, but once it's painted, it'll look great, and I'm sure I have some skills to learn about dealing with this new material as well. With that done and the holes drilled for the chains finished, I was able to thread the banner on and fasten it to the other side. At the moment, the banner is all floppy, and you can definitely keep it like that if you want, but I wanted to fasten it in place, and I did that again with some super glue thin. Be sparing with this stuff because it has a tendency to get everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Alright, let's get even weirder. When this commission was sent to me, it was also sent with some bits from the Forge Fiend kit for conversions. I wanted to use the assault cannon looking thing, but it was a little dinky, so I grabbed some hollow styrene rods that were similar in diameter and glued them to the weapon with a larger diameter rod running through the middle. I trued up the ends of these pipes with some gentle sanding once the glue was cured. Now, the part that this thing would normally attach to has a gaping hole in it, so I busted out my trusty circle cutter and cut a little styrene disc that fit nicely into the hole. This gave me a surface that I could glue my weapon to. With that glued in place, I took some guitar string, which makes for great 2-scale cables, and attached them from the holes in the gun to the holes below the big shield of the gun. Undoubtedly, this is also a weapon of some kind that I am clogging up with cables, but it looks cool, so who cares? It's a little hard to bend guitar string without getting a kink in it, so I try to only bend it over round surfaces, but even that's not perfect. Next up, I sculpted a bit on the bottom of the gun to make it look less like it was just awkwardly glued in place and more like it was an actual fixture attached to the weapon. I used more of the metal sculpting tools, color shapers, and plenty of water to get a nice finish. I also sanded the part that connected to the plastic kit to make sure it was nice and seamless. To finish it off, I sanded a flat side on a skull and attached it to the middle of the assault cannon, cause it's a bad guy Renegade Knight, you know, chaos and stuff. Also, there's a massive hole in one side of the gun where I presume it gets attached to a Forge Fiend. I just stuffed a bunch of epoxy sculpt in there and a couple of skulls again because chaos! Does anyone pronounce it chouse? Chouse. Sounds less chaosy. Alright, on to the last bit of conversion, the battle cannon. Using another bit from the Forge Fiend kit, I sawed it down to size. I wanted the cannon to be coming out of the mouth of whatever demon weapon this thing was, and I had some resizing to do. I had to widen the gap in the mouth, but also the size of the cannon so that it matched the width of this mouth weapon thing. After a lot of cutting and sanding, I was able to get a pretty nice fit that I glued into place. Like the previous weapon, I glued in a piece of styrene into the cavity in the big gun arm thing so I could actually attach it. Since the end that would get attached was all gnarly because I sawed it in half, I pinned it in with a piece of brass and some super glue. This gave me a nice sturdy connection that I could now start sculpting on. Now this clip is very old and I have no idea why I was sculpting what I was sculpting, but that looks like a wiener, does it not? Thank God I had some sense and instead just sculpted a bunch of puffy looking flesh around it, almost like the engineers that added this on had to keep it in place with some dark magic. Dark willy magic, apparently. The key to get a nice smooth finish is silicone color shapers and a cruddy brush with some water in it, applying water liberally to the epoxy sculpt. Lastly, I had to sculpt in some more gums and teeth so the forged weapon itself connected to the battle cannon. With that complete, that was the last bit of conversion on this model. That process in and of itself took close to 50 hours. Let's see how long I quoted this commission for. Well, I messed up. Moving on. As one last bit of surface prep, I cleaned off the model with a toothbrush and some soapy water. I manhandled the crap out of this thing a lot, so I was looking to clean off any remaining finger oils, plastic shavings, etc. Alright, we're about halfway through this now. Let's take a brief break to thank the sponsor of this video. Cobalt Keep is a miniature accessory brand. Their bread and butter focuses around the usage of magnets. Cobalt Keep sells a variety of base sizes that you might find in typical games, but what's special about these bases is the magnet well on the underside, which allows for easy installation of a magnet with a little super glue. Now your minis are able to stick to any metal surface, such as a figure case or Cobalt Keep's painting handles that come in two different sizes, one a little larger than the other for different hand sizes. The number of ideas that can take advantage of magnets is endless, and a new product that Cobalt Keep is currently releasing on Kickstarter are their stackable display cases. Coming in a variety of sizes, you can display your heroes, entire units, and more inside these display cases for transport, and also for showing off to friends and family. The stackable display cases make storage easy even if you have limited space. You can find their Kickstarter linked in the description below, and it is running until the end of the day on November 1st. Check it out and take advantage of a hefty discount on the products in the Kickstarter. Additionally, from now until the end of October, you can get a 20% off discount on their web store when using the code MOIST at checkout. That was not their idea, it was one of my patrons' ideas, and I loved it. You can find all their stuff linked in the description below. Thanks for sponsoring YouTubers Cobalt Keep. Now back to the video. The first couple stages of painting are pretty straightforward. I applied a black primer all over the model to improve paint adhesion and then started applying a silver base coat. I used Vallejo Metal Color Aluminum, a fairly bright silver, because I plan to muddy it down quite a bit later on in the painting process. With that done, I moved on to applying the first of the House Atrax colors, the chosen chapter for this Renegade Knight. I applied the dark gray without doing any masking for the silver. I figured that in certain areas it would just look like greasy dust, and in other areas I could just paint the silver over it with a paintbrush, and that would be a lot faster than masking everything off meticulously. With the base coat down, I applied layers of highlights, getting brighter and brighter. I had to keep in mind that once I started to dirty this thing up, it would likely get darker, so I need to shoot higher than what I want my end result to be. Lastly, I applied a black shade with the airbrush. For the panels that are large and flat, I simply did a gradient from top to bottom. Sometimes having a nicely smooth blend on a model is cool enough. It doesn't have to necessarily be realistic. On other parts that had more interesting volumes, I did consider a zenithal lighting, like on the chest shield. You don't necessarily need an airbrush to paint a knight, but to get blends like this that span the entirety of the whole of the model, it can sure as heck make it infinitely easier. I can't imagine trying to get this massive gradient with a brush in under 5 hours. If you're watching this and you're like,
"But Scott, I don't have an airbrush,"
that's totally okay. Just maybe don't go for something as grandiose as a blend across each and every panel of this monster. A base coat with some recessed shading and some edge highlighting looks cool enough. After that was done, I did some masking to cover up half of the shoulder pads and the chest shield, and did the red half of the armor, the other House Atrax color. I did this in a very similar fashion, starting with a mid-tone, applying 2 highlights, and then a shadow to finish it off. With the red complete, I could peel the tape off for a very crispy reveal. Ooh, that's nice. Well, that was extremely satisfying. I suppose I should do something that is extremely unsatisfying to balance it out. How about painting golden trim forever? And ever, and ever, and ever.
Is this thing on? Oh my god! I've been base coating metallics for 9 hours straight. That took a long time.
To finish up the base coating, I painted a copper metal accent color on various bits and bobs around the model, and also painted some yellow and gray cables around the model. There are other details that do need to be painted, but I'll wrap those up in the end. For now, this is all the major color down, and I can move on to a step that's very unfamiliar to me. Something that I learned while painting this guy is that the knights have very specific iconography on the majority of their armor panels. One could freehand all of this, but that would take a long time, and as you remember, I instead used decals, which were sent along with the knight, and that's going to save a lot of time. Applying decals to big surfaces like this isn't the most complicated thing, so here's a quick tutorial. Cut out the decal that you need and moisten it in water and set it down for 2 to 3 minutes. Once you're nearing the end of that time, prepare the surface of where the decal will be with some microset, a solvent designed to work with decals. While that's still wet, grab the transfer paper with your decal on it and slide it off using whatever tool is comfortable to you. A great option is the paintbrush. At this point, you still have a lot of adjustability to get it in the right spot. Sometimes the brush doesn't cut it, and I like to have something a little bit harder like an old airbrush needle or tweezers. Once the placement is right, gently apply some micro sol to the decal. This will soften the decal, helping it conform to the surface a lot better. It's important to get the location correct before doing this, as this softens the decal a lot, making it very difficult to adjust without getting wrinkles and bubbles in it. This is a pretty good intro to decals for myself because all the surfaces are nice and large and fairly uniform, so I went a little crazy applying decals all over the model. We'll deal with hiding the fact that these are decals a little bit later. Okay, that's cool, but how about the specific House Atrax iconography? I don't have decals for that. Well, I splurged a bit and bought this machine. This is a Cricut, and it is essentially an X-Acto blade attached to a CNC. I created a design for the chapter in Adobe Illustrator and cut it out on the Cricut using non-permanent vinyl stickers, and shockingly, it actually worked out fantastically on the first try, which was not what I was expecting at all. This tool is absolutely magical, and expect to see me using it in the future, specifically for cutting thin styrene for terrain. It's gonna be awesome. With the stencils cut out, I had one last bit of surface prep that I was going to do, and that was adding some heavy chipping medium to the surfaces where I plan on applying these icons. I wanted the icons to be worn and chipped, but I also wanted to show the cool gradient I had worked on beneath where the red and gray show through. After the armor was sufficiently masked off and my stencils were on, I applied my white. I tried to go slowly and thinly so as not to flood the surface. When I removed the mask, I was met with some pretty extreme disappointment. I applied too heavy a layer of chipping medium and the paint adhered more to the vinyl than it did to the model. Luckily for me, this was going to be chipped anyways, and with some white paint and a paintbrush, I could add more of the sword back that I wanted. With that lesson learned, I applied a diluted version of the chipping medium to the next shoulder pad and had a lot more success. One nice side effect about having chipping medium down where I wanted to apply these stencils was that I could essentially wipe away any spots that were accidents, like it leaked past the masking with some brush and some water. I tried it yet again without any chipping medium at all with a gear right on top of the hole. This sort of stencil is incredibly helpful because painting perfect circles is incredibly difficult without it looking super wonky. This third attempt was crispy AF. If you're planning on doing this even with just normal masks that you might buy from a third party, experiment with the levels of chipping medium that you apply, how long you wait for the medium to dry, etc. It will all affect your end result. Lastly, I couldn't avoid freehand altogether. Certain designs were too small for the Cricut to render, at least on my first try, so instead of trying to troubleshoot it, I just resorted to freehanding a little octopus lightning bolt guy instead. If you want a deep dive into freehanding specifically, check out a video that I've linked in the top right hand corner and also the description. Alright, that finishes up all the iconography on the night. Now on to the super fun step, weathering. Weathering is going to dirty up this model for us, but also provide us with some much needed depth. To start out, however, I painted some chips and some dings on the decals and painted logos that I had just added to simulate a chipping effect like I got on the shoulder pads. This will be our first level of hiding the fact that these are decals. Next, it's time to pull out the big guns. I've never messed around with oil washes before, but why not start on the largest model I've ever painted and the last commission? Everything will be just fine, right? Spoilers! Everything is actually fine. Go figure. I started by making a mixture of 2-to-1 black and brown oil paint to which I added white spirits. I don't entirely know what viscosity to shoot for, so I just mixed up something that seemed thin enough to apply through an airbrush. You can totally apply this with a paintbrush and it works amazingly, but I decided to use an airbrush to expedite the process. Applying an even layer of this stuff over a large surface is very quick with an airbrush, and here's a disclaimer. This stuff is probably awful to breathe in. While I was doing this, I was wearing a respirator, I had an air purifier running, and I had a fan running in an area pointed at an open window. I hope that I appeased the YouTube health police with this grand gesture of safety. Seriously though, this is not water-based acrylic paint. You don't want to haphazardly spray it around. Once it was on and looked like it was dry, I began to dab it up with some more white spirits and this makeshift sponge on a stick tool, patent pending. In an episode of Trapped Under Plastic, my co-host John let me know about these eye makeup sponge things that are great for this operation, but I didn't have any, so I tried to make one, and you know what? It worked out great. The sponge was moistened with white spirits, not soaked in it. I mostly was swiping toward the recesses on the model so the oil paint would collect there. After each part, I rinsed out the little sponge in more white spirits and proceeded, and it lasted the entire time. Good job, little sponge boy. You can remove as much or as little as you want, depending on how weathered of an appearance you want. What I'm left with is a crusty, dirty-looking machine. The technique worked perfectly to add the depth that I needed while also giving the knight a whole layer of lovely grime. To add more weathering, I applied straight-up brown oil paint to various cracks and creases and then streaked it with a soft, non-wet brush to get these nice drips. If you want more of a sharper drip line, you can use a brush wetted with white spirits. Both options work, they just get you a different effect. With that all done, I let it sit for a day, and then the following morning I sprayed the whole model with a matte varnish. You don't necessarily need to do this for oil paint, but I wanted to as a final layer over my decals. With the chipping, the oil wash, and the varnish, this nicely blends the decals into the surface. As a last bit of weathering, it was time for some good old faithful chipping that I've shown off in previous videos. In all the chips and dings that I added with my Dremel, I painted on some black to represent a layer of primer showing beneath. Then with some silver paint, I painted inside that black to represent the metal of the armor showing through. I probably should have done this before doing the oil paint drips, but you know what? I forgot, and that's okay. With all the chips and dings complete, I added a pinkish and light gray scratchy edge highlight to most of the edges and also the underside of all the black scrapes that I just added. This not only shows off a lot of the cool paneling on the model, but it also emphasizes the wear and tear. It also gives those little black chips a 3D feel to them, like light is hitting the bottom edge of them, making the battle damage feel concave. Lastly, I applied some gold highlight to the trim with a sponge, which can be a little tricky. Sometimes the sponge wanted to wrap over the edge of the trim and hit the armor, which is obviously something you want to avoid. This added a nice highlight to the gold, but in a spotty, weathered way. Bonus points because it was pretty easy to do as well. That should finish off the weathering portion of the night that gave us a lot of depth and highlights. It's cool how we can essentially kill two birds with one stone, adding grit and grime and contrast at the same time. Now let's finish painting the model itself with a few extra parts. We've laid a good groundwork for this model to look cool from the tabletop. Now let's spice it up with some fun details. These are the kinds of choices that are like little Easter eggs for the paint job that people notice as they pick it up and look the model over. We'll start with the chest-mounted turret. I wanted to add some caution stripes to this. I think the idea works well because it naturally incorporates our spot color, which is yellow, without just painting the whole thing yellow. I began with a medium gray undercoat and started to build up highlights toward the top and the bottom of this shape that flares out toward the gun barrel. Then with a combination of yellows as my highlight and oranges as my shadow, I sort of wet blend on top of these stripes. While the undercoat process wasn't entirely necessary, it helps to reach opacity very quickly with yellow and orange. Once I got the general look complete, I added in some weathering by painting some black chips and dings. This is a great way to hide any crimes we might have committed by going outside the lines with our yellow or having the lines not even the right widths. After that, I moved on to adding some grease to what seems like joints and pistons. Using Tamiya Clear Orange, I apply little drips. This is like the fresh grease to what looks like dirt and buildup that we got with our oil wash. Weathering is all about having nice variety, and a glossy finish for this is a nice contrast to our previous matte attempts. For the fleshy connection that we sculpted earlier, I started with a normal base coat and wash, much like you'd paint any other skin tone. I then started to highlight, and this is where it got a little funky. I mixed in a very light green so the skin tone looked slightly ill, and then to ensure that no one had any question about whether or not this skin was healthy, I also added in some nasty yellow and green drips from the folds of the flesh. I also added in some tiny glass nail art beads to simulate some kind of bubbling. Lastly, we need to do some kind of freehand lettering. On the saw blade, there was some small scrollwork that I added the word vile to because, you know, chaos. On the chest itself, however, I asked the commissioner what he wanted because this represented the name of the night itself, and he asked for the word carnage. While that word is kind of long, it has one advantage, and that is that it's 7 letters, or an odd number. This means that I can place the N right in the middle of the scroll and work out from there, one letter at a time, making sure that I size each letter correctly. This has the added benefit of not needing to worry about filling the whole scroll. As long as it's centered, I'm pretty much good to go. The black I'm using here is a mixture of black paint and black ink, which thins down the black paint nicely so it flows off the brush, but also doesn't reduce the opacity of the black as much as something like water might. I just have a few more details I need to scrape together, like the skulls, the body I added at the shoulder pad, and some other things. The end is so close, I can feel it. For such an epic model, we need an equally epic base. To represent the scale and mass of this unit in-game, I wanted to depict the knight crushing a barrier. I plotted out approximately where the barrier would go, and I made sure that the knight's foot would fit in the opening. I began to build up some structure with square styrene stock, and then with these supports I could start to adhere sheets of brick texture to it. Since all these parts are plastic glue will work to stick them all together. Before gluing on the brick texture, I removed some bricks like they had popped out due to the strain of the knight's foot. Next up, I added some more structure, this time attaching it to the brick wall itself, and this allowed me to add some cool metal styrene texture to the top of my wall like a walkway. I distressed the edges of this with some clippers and an X-Acto knife and then glued it down. With some rectangular styrene stock, I scored a line down the center of it and widened that line with a triangular file down the length, and then this little groove allowed me to glue it on top of the edge of the brick wall. This allowed me to kind of hide the fact that these bricks were unrealistically skinny, but honestly it doesn't really matter a ton because everyone's going to be looking at the model itself, and details like these are kind of the cherry on top. With the main structure done, I stuffed the insides with mostly tin foil but also milliput on the outside. While the putty was still curing, I was also able to stuff a bunch of debris into it like cables, some of the walkway material, some resin bricks that I have, and all sorts of rubble. It's important to mention that at multiple points of working on this barrier, I always check to see if the knight's foot still fit. With the wall squared away, I started to add some low points in the base by cutting out holes again with the ball burr bit in my Dremel. This is fairly messy, but it gets the job done on a fairly thick material, whereas an X-Acto would take a lot longer than I care to spend. After some basic cleaning with some files and some blades, I could trace the perimeter onto some thin styrene below and then adhere it to the bottom of my base with a snake of milliput and some superglue. Then with some pressure I could push the base flat, which causes the milliput to squeeze out, and with a wetted finger I can bevel this squeeze out to make a nice slope into a shallow little pond. With the main structure done, I could apply some dirt with some PVA glue all over the base, add a few extra knickknacks like skulls, bricks, and larger rocks, and then seal it all in place with some superglue thin. Now we're ready for some paint. I did end up priming this because there are elements that are plastic and resin that might benefit from it, but it's not likely necessary. I started by applying a nice rich brown color. I then built up a few orange colors on the base to cause a vignetting effect toward the center of the base. This base was supposed to be a desert, which is why I chose these tones initially. I also specifically chose Scale 75 paints because it dries extra matte, which helps enforce the idea this is a arid, sandy place. While I had the airbrush out, I started to base coat the walls as well, not caring too much if some red remained on the bricks. I did take some time to base coat some of the other details like the bricks and the large rocks and the metal walkway. I applied a quick shade to some of the rubble and the walkway to give them some depth. Lastly, for the little ponds, I added some Mod Podge Dimensional Magic and a bit of black ink to create this nasty Icarus spill, to which I added some drops of Tamiya Clear Orange, like a little drop of grease and whatever this liquid is supposed to be. Not shown here is me adding a bunch of desert vegetation and some dry pigments, but apparently I was too excited to glue everything together that I forgot to hit record. So I guess this brings us finally to the end. Just kidding, I'm a dumbass and did the chest freehand upside down. Let me just quickly redo that and then we can get onto the epic B-roll. I don't know why it feels dirty to be proud of your work and also say it out loud, but screw it. I like feeling dirty anyways. I think this thing looks friggin' epic. Gluing it together was absolutely an amazing feeling until, of course, I realized I did the chest wrong, but once I fixed that, everything was fine. It's hard to describe how finishing my last commission feels without sounding like an entitled, whiny baby. I have no more miniature obligations to anyone, and while I realize that I put myself in this position and I am being paid to do this, sometimes you commit to things that you end up not wanting to do. It's a reality of life. Whether it's because you're a greenie, you overestimate your ability, you're pressured into it, or a mixture of those things and more, it just happens. I'm the kind of person that can never back down from something that I committed to do, no matter how long it takes me, so it feels great to finish this project for someone who was relying on it and waiting patiently for me. Let's all thank Zach below in the comment section for putting up with my schedule. I really hope you enjoyed this epic video. Not all videos are going to be like this, but I look forward to being able to do something like this every once in a while. Before I let you go, let me remind you that the Miniac 100,000 subscriber charity event is underway, and you can buy raffle tickets for each of the 4 armies that you guys painted. The proceeds go to 3 awesome charities, and they're fairly inexpensive raffle tickets, so go buy a couple if you're able to, or at least go check out the awesome armies this community painted up. If you have more cash burning a hole in your pocket and you want to support this channel, there are a couple ways that you can do that. Namely, a Patreon campaign with a bunch of fun rewards like a Discord server where you can hang out with me any day of the week and chat about your miniature painting projects, or sculpting phallic things with Epoxy Sculpt. You also get my videos early, and you can also watch my stream VODs after they're complete. Alternatively, you can buy merch and also miniatures off my website, and also digital courses that I made for those miniatures. You can buy hobby equipment that I recommend in the description of this video, and that's about it. Subscribe or die, but most importantly, don't forget to paint my